class! This week we're covering Chapter 3, the research process. So let's talk about why learning about research is important for professional development. I know a lot of you don't like research and don't think it's important, or not necessarily that you don't feel like it's important, it's just that you feel like you won't use it. But let's talk about that. The knowledge and skills that you get from research can benefit society. Aaron Beck's research on the effectiveness of cognitive behavior therapy led to us is still using his treatment today. So I'm pretty sure you're all aware of Aaron Beck's research of the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and his research on that has led us to still using his treatment today. So even if you're going to be a clinical social worker working with clients directly, you are still using research. Someone has to do the research to make sure those treatments that you're using in your clinical practice actually work. Research can inform and change policies. So working with clients, you may find that there's a policy that is not beneficial to your client or it's not helping them at all. So as a social worker, your responsibility is the well-being of your clients. And so as a researcher, you may look up policies that are in place and see if they are being followed, or also looking at the policy to see how it benefits your clients. It's possible that you may need to do some more research to find out, like, we may need to change the policy. So doing your research to show why this policy needs to be changed. Research can change practice. So research conducted by social workers has impacted the way that the profession works with diverse and marginalized individuals, families, groups, and communities. So research helps us work with diverse groups. It provides information on how to deal with different groups and how what may work with one group may not work with the other group, but not knowing that based on the research would be difficult to do. So 3 out of the 9 CSWE prescribed competencies emphasize the need for social workers to learn about research. Competency 1 is to demonstrate ethical and professional behavior. Competency 4 is to engage in practice-informed research and research-informed practice. And competency 9 is to evaluate practice with individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities. A social worker will always use research to inform practice and policies. For example, the interventions that you learn about and use with your clients today may not be the ones that you will use in the future. And that's where research comes in. One must be competent in critically evaluating empirically based literature, because as knowledge changes, one needs to ensure that they are using effective intervention with your clients. Because as of right now, something may be working, but 10 years later, that intervention may no longer be working. So that's where the research comes in. As a social worker, you will need to keep up with the literature. You'll also need to be able to critically evaluate those literature to be able to find what works best for your client. Research is a systematic process of inquiry designed to collect, analyze, and interpret data. Deductive reasoning involves using a theory to inform the development of a hypothesis. The goal of deductive reasoning is to determine the extent to which observation or data confirms a theory based on whether the data confirm that hypothesis or fails to confirm that hypothesis. Inductive reasoning differs from deductive reasoning in that the researchers do not start with a hypothesis. They begin with a set of observations. Through continued observation, researchers try to determine if there is a pattern that can be used to inform a hypothesis, which describes the pattern. Inductive reasoning can inform the development of a theory that can then be used to select an intervention. So they work in different ways. And researchers may choose to shift between the two. They might start off with deductive and go on to inductive, or vice versa. So looking at this table or this graph, we can see that deduction starts with a theory that leads to a hypothesis, which is a testable prediction about the relationship among variables. The hypothesis then leads to an observation and then to a confirmation of whether that hypothesis is true or not. With induction, we start off with an observation. That observation leads to a pattern. That pattern then leads to a hypothesis, which then brings us to a theory. All right, so let's talk about variables. An independent variable is a variable that results in a change in the other variable. So the independent variable results in the change in the dependent variable. The dependent variable is a variable that is affected by the independent variable or the outcome of the independent variable. When I think of the dependent variable, I think of it as the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So that way you don't get them confused, because all you have to do is, looking at two variables, you look and see which one's dependent on the other one. For the independent variable, that's the one that results in a change in the dependent variable. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. All right, so just remember, independent variable is the variable that results in a change in the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the variable that is affected by the independent variable. So applied research is research conducted to address or solve problems. For example, researcher determining the effectiveness of an intervention to reduce substance use. Basic research is research conducted to increase scientific knowledge. It does not intend to address or solve a problem. For example, researcher is determining what factors contribute to substance abuse. Okay, so looking at the graph, here are the categories of research. You may make an observation, something seems like it's a problem that needs to be solved. Then based on that observation, you come up with a question. You have a question that you may want to research. From that question, you need to look at the literature. What does the literature say about your topic? From your literature, you may develop a theory and empirical research questions. From that, you will go on to designing your research, so coming up with the research design that you'll use. Once that's done, then you'll start collecting your data. Once data collection is complete, you analyze the results. Once you analyze the results, what you'll do to tie everything up is compare your results with the existing literature. Quantitative research is a method of inquiry where the researcher engages in gathering data in such a way that the data can be counted or described in a quantifiable way. So think about numbers when you think about quantitative research. It is often guided by deductive reasoning. It is also aligned with the positivism research paradigm, which is a belief system that assumes that objective universal truth can be derived via observation and experience with that phenomenon. Qualitative research, the data are collected first and then they're analyzed. With qualitative research, this is a method of inquiry where the researcher is interested in understanding the lived experiences of the participants from their own perspective. So it is aligned with the social constructivism research paradigm, which is a belief that assumes that universal truth cannot exist because there are multiple contextual perspectives and subjective voices that can label truth in scientific pursuit. So with quantitative, they look at it from an objective perspective. With qualitative, the researchers look at it from a subjective perspective. Mixed methods is when the research conducted is using both quantitative and qualitative data collection methods. Cross-sectional research is research where the data are only collected one point in time. For your final project plan, you will be designing a cross-sectional research. Longitudinal research is research where the data is collected at multiple points in time. It's conducted to assess change over time in the variable of interest. There's 3 types of longitudinal research, which differs in design according to how the participants are selected. In a trend study, the participants are selected from a pool of potential participants at different points in time, and the pool of participants changes over time. In a cohort study, the pool of potential participants does not change, but the specific cases selected to the study differ during the stages of data collection. In a panel study, the exact same participants are studied over time. Changes in the group composition would be due to attrition, so only if participants drop out of the study. The purpose of research is to describe, to explore, to explain, or to evaluate. So with descriptive research, this is conducted to describe the phenomenon under investigation. Both quantitative and qualitative research methods can be used to conduct a descriptive study. For example, if a researcher is interested in determining the needs of adolescents transitioning out of foster care, or in describing the characteristics of adults who use opioids. With exploratory research, this is conducted when we do not know very much about the phenomenon or when you want to gain new insight about the phenomenon. This type of research aims to determine if there's a relationship between variables of interest. Both quantitative and qualitative research methods can be used to conduct an exploratory study. An example of an exploratory study would be if a researcher is interested in examining the effects of opioid use in older adults, meaning that there may not be much research in the area, and so the study would need to be exploratory. Explanatory research is conducted to examine the causal relationships among variables. So researchers here are interested in testing the hypothesis. Quantitative methods are used to conduct explanatory research. You cannot really conduct a qualitative study for an explanatory research. For example, a researcher is interested in examining the effectiveness of an intervention on a specific outcome. Evaluative research is also known as program evaluation or practice evaluation. They're often conducted if a new program is needed. This is called formative evaluation. It is also conducted if the researcher wants to know the effectiveness of an existing program, which is considered summative evaluation. If the program resulted in participants attaining a certain outcome, which is also summative. Research design is a plan that provides the logical structure that guides the investigator or the researcher to address the research problems and answer research questions. So many decisions need to be made to carry out research. So some questions to think about are, what are the specific research questions? Who should be the participants? How will they be selected? What variables will need to be measured and how? The research design will help you answer all these questions. Detailing how and when the data will be collected, analyzed, and disseminated, which variables will be measured, and how and who will make up the sample, and how they will be selected. So there are three categories of research design. The first one is experimental research design. The experimental research designs are the ones in which there is manipulation of the independent variable by the researcher, and the focus of the study is basically to examine causality. So in this case, the researcher wants to provide evidence that the independent variable really affected or influenced the dependent variable. So with this design, the researcher wants to provide evidence that the independent variable did affect or influence the dependent variable in the way that they hypothesized. So with an experimental research design, participants have to be randomly assigned to groups. Non-experimental research designs are known as correlational research designs. So in these studies, the researcher may be interested in providing evidence that two or more variables are associated or related or correlated with one another. But the researcher does not or cannot control or manipulate the independent variable. Therefore, they cannot prove that the independent variable really made a change or really had an influence on the dependent variable. Observational research designs are used to determine the effects of exposure to a variable of interest that is not under the control of the researcher. So the variable could potentially serve as the independent variable in a study examining a causal relationship. This type of research design is used when it is unethical to conduct an experimental research design. An example of an unethical study would be one where the researcher exposed the participants to a toxic gas to determine the effects on their lungs. That would be unethical, right? We wouldn't want to do a research study like that. As a researcher, doing so would be considered unethical. However, in an ethical observational study, You may study participants who have already been exposed to the gas, so you cannot expose them to it. But if you found out that there is a group of people who were exposed to this gas, which is what you're studying, you are able to observe them. All right, so now we're going to talk about the research process. So step one is problem formulation. During the problem formulation phase, the researcher is concerned with identifying the research problem to be examined and the research question to be asked. So once you've selected your research problem and identified your research question, you are now ready to move on to your research design. So these can be experimental, non-experimental, or observational. Once you're done with your design, you can move on to your sampling. So with your sample, you're concerned about the type of sampling strategy that you're going to use to select your sample. Next, you need to decide on your measurement. So whichever measure you decide to use should be reliable and valid. When it comes to data collection, you are concerned about the methods to use to collect your data, whether you're going to use focus groups, interviews, observations, or use standardized measures. Once you've collected your data, then you are now ready to start your data analysis. So the type of analysis that you will use will depend upon the way that the variables were measured or operationalized. We're going to cover each part of the research process in detail. So there's a chapter on the design, there's a chapter on sampling, there's a chapter in measurement, there's a chapter in data collection. We are going to go over each one of those designs or each one of those process or steps in detail as we read through the chapters. But those are all the steps that you need to think about. Those are all going to go in your final project plan. So your final project plan, you'll have a research question, which your problem formulation will lead you to your question. You'll have a design. You'll have to come up with your sampling strategy. You'll develop your measurement or use a standardized one. You will have to describe your data collection and will also include a data analysis. So dissemination is basically once you get your results back, how you're going to share that with interested parties. All right, so that brings us to the end of chapter 3.